weekly webinar series. As you know, that the EGROW Foundation is a policy-oriented research think tank, and we have been making an attempt for more than a year now to make the best of the COVID time. We have had the best minds from across the world come and speak to us on contemporary issues that are concerning India policy making. It is in that very sequence of things that today we have invited Dr. Surjit Bhalla, Dr. Prakash Loungani, and Karan Bhasin to come and speak to us on inflation targeting. To chair this session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, who is the chairman of EGROW Foundation. Dr. Virmani himself is a very accomplished economist. He has published extensively books and articles in refereed journals. He was the chief economic advisor of our country. He was also the executive director at the International Monetary Fund from 2009 to 2012. He chairs the session today. Dr. Virmani, please.
Thank you, Karan.
मैं अभी मेरी वेबिनार है.
So, well, I think all our speakers have spoken before, so I'll be very brief in the introduction. Dr. Surjit Bhalla, of course, is the ED, currently the ED at the IMF. Prakash Loungani is the assistant director at the IMF, and Karan Bhasin is an economist currently located in New York. So with that, let me hand it over to you, Prakash. I guess you're going to start the talk.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Arvind. Thanks, Charan, for inviting us to give this presentation. This is the first time that we are presenting this paper. So we appreciate the opportunity and look forward to your feedback. Let me share my screen. Okay, are you able to see it? I assume people can see this. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a joint work with Surjit and Karan. And as always, this is the view of what we say are the views of the presenters and should not be attributed to the IMF or to its executive board or to the Independent Evaluation Office, the IEO. Okay, I'm trying to advance the slides now, but should have checked that too. Okay. So this paper that I'm presenting today is part of 3 papers that the 3 of us have worked on. Today's paper, as you see, is called Inflation Targeting, Vaccine or Placebo. Last year, Surjit had presented very detailed case study that we have done on inflation targeting in India, benefits and costs. Ila Patnaik had discussed that paper. So if there is time and there is interest, we can at least mention some of the findings from that paper as well. And then the third paper, which is still in the works, is understanding the great inflation moderation. We have a number of results, but we still have to write it up finally. And some of those results had been discussed in an IO webinar recently by Surjit, with comments from Paul Krugman, Larry Ball, and Shonali Das. So, of course, right now, everybody is worried about the upsurge in inflation and how long it will last. And how high will inflation go before hopefully it subsides. But until this recent upsurge, the big story about inflation had actually been a decline for 2 decades. And that is shown in this picture where you're looking at the median inflation in the advanced economies, the blue line, and the median inflation in emerging markets, the red line. And basically you can see that, with some blips, inflation has been on a trend decline in both advanced economies and EMs. So we'll talk later about the implications of our finding for the current conjuncture, but at least through most of the presentation, we're going to set it aside and talk more about trying to understand this huge decline in inflation. Now, there are two very broad classes of explanation for this decline, and they're not mutually exclusive. The decline that you saw in the previous slide was quite extensive. There is enough credit to go around that both these explanations could be somewhat at play. So one broad class of explanations is that monetary management has gotten better since the 70s. So the story is in the 70s, the Fed let inflation get out of hand and has learned from that experience and has learned how to manage inflation better. And as part of that better management, a key innovation is said to be the adoption of inflation targeting, which was done initially by New Zealand in 1989. And the story goes that this adoption of inflation targeting has allowed inflation expectations to become anchored. So people now in this story feel that the central banks are really have their eye on the ball as far as inflation. They're not going to let it get out of hand in a permanent way, so that when there are small inflation surprises, some blips, people don't change their expectations. Their expectations become anchored. And there is also a claim made that having a formal framework, having some basis for making decisions has led to fewer policy mistakes, as opposed to what is characterized as an earlier regime where there was a lot of discretion. But the inflation targeting framework and monetary policy committees and so on that come as part of that adoption are said to have led to fewer policy mistakes. So that's one class of explanations. The second is that there are structural factors that account for the decline in inflation. Many people have written about demographics. There is a set of authors at the BIS who have done extremely good work on this. And there's been a book that has gotten a lot of play by Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan, who argue that demographics has been behind many of the changes in macroeconomic variables that we have seen over the past 2 decades. A second story is that globalization is responsible for the decline in inflation. This was a point made initially quite forcefully by Ken Rogoff, a former chief economist of the IMF, a Harvard professor, in a talk that he gave at the Jackson Hole conference of the Fed. And Surjit and I individually have emphasized different aspects of that globalization. The common element in our two explanations is that with increasing globalization, the bargaining power, the market power of unskilled and to some extent even skilled people in the West declines. And in Surjit's story, it's kind of the spread of education and training in the rest of the world, in the South, if you will, is what challenges wage growth and therefore inflation in the West. In my story, allowing capital to move freely, or at least giving capital the threat to move factories to the global South, again, eviscerates the bargaining power of workers. But both of these stories feed in the same direction, namely the channel is through reduced bargaining power of workers to get wage growth and therefore feed that into inflation. So these are the 3 papers that we are working on. And what are the takeaways from this work? What I will hope to show you today is the first point, namely that if you follow the science, as we are all being encouraged to do these days, it's difficult to make the case that formal adoption of inflation targeting is responsible for the decline in inflation that I showed you. And the second takeaway, which we can discuss, but as I said, we are still putting together the evidence, is that the structural view offers a convincing narrative for the decline in inflation. So on the one hand, we think better monetary management is being overplayed as a possible explanation. On the other hand, we think structural factors offer a convincing alternate view. But again, I would emphasize that these are not mutually exclusive. It could be that there's a bit of both going on. So let me turn to today's paper. In this paper, we look at the experience of countries that formally adopted inflation targeting and compare them to a group of countries that did not formally adopt inflation targeting. So after New Zealand's adoption of inflation targeting in 1989, as I said, over that decade, there were many other adopters. 11 of them are the 11 that adopted are listed here. And all of them saw a decline. So if you compare the inflation rates that they had in the 3 years prior to the adoption of inflation targeting and compare them with the inflation in the 3 years after they adopted inflation targeting, all of them saw a decline. And this, understandably gave inflation targeting a very good name. It gave central bankers a lot to boast about, that, look, we have this sort of magic bullet, you just adopt it and your inflation falls. And in the decade of the 2000s, you had 15 adopters, and the movement spread more and more to emerging markets. And 60% of those countries saw a decline. And then in the more recent decade, 7 additional countries, including the US and India, adopted inflation targeting, and 30% of those countries saw a decline. The ECB does not classify itself as an inflation targeter, but everyone else regards it as one. They have an explicit 2% inflation target that they're trying to meet. Now, you may wonder what it was about those early adopters, the 11 that are shown in red in that first bullet. Why was there kind of what you might think is a declining efficacy of inflation targeting? The reason is actually quite simple. The early adopters adopted inflation targeting at a time of high inflation in general. Their inflation rates were high. And the later adopters generally adopted inflation in an environment where inflation had already been coming down and was fairly low. So what you see quite clearly, just this one variable has an explanatory power of over 50%. Namely that if you adopted inflation targeting when your inflation was quite high, you saw a very substantial decline in inflation. Whereas if you adopted it at low levels of initial inflation, you didn't see much of a decline. Okay. This is a hint at the story that we will pick up later. Now, the evidence that I will present will be in kind of 3 groups. This is the first group. Here, I'll just show you some evidence on IT adopters versus others and present some summary statistics and basically show you that on a number of dimensions, there is really no difference between the IT adopters and the others. So first, let's just look at inflation developments in IT and non-IT countries. What you see through these bars, the blue for adopters, orange for non-adopters, is that inflation was virtually the same in both countries in terms of outcomes over the decades that are shown. If you look at inflation volatility measured by the standard deviation of inflation, it was somewhat higher in non-IT emerging markets. In advanced economies, there was not much difference. If anything, it was lower for non-IT. But in EMs, it is indeed the case that the standard deviation of inflation was somewhat higher in the non-IT group. If you look at inflation expectations, again, there is not much difference. The scale on the left is quite small. It's only from 1.7 to 2, so the differences are not that meaningful economically. So essentially, the story here would be that inflation expectations were quite similar in both groups. And finally, this anchoring of inflation on which the IT proponents put a lot of weight, that we can look at a little more formally by using a framework that Levin, Natalucci, and Piger, and I, in an earlier paper with others, have used to see whether or not, in a formal sense, inflation expectations are anchored. So on the left-hand side, we measure the change in inflation expectations into some years in the future. So we can try either the 3-year ahead inflation, for instance, or 5-year ahead or 10-year ahead inflation. So the results that I will show you will be for the 3-year ahead inflation expectations, but the results are similar for 5 and 10. So that's the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, after controlling for fixed effects, you have this term which is called inflation surprise, pi surprise. It's the deviation in current inflation from the 3-period moving average. So this is sort of the kind of blip I talked about in inflation. So suppose the story is, suppose there is a sudden blip in inflation. Does it destabilize the left-hand side, the inflation expectations? So the test of anchoring would be that the beta 1 coefficient should be 0. Inflation blips don't change inflation expectations. Now, the results that I will show you in the next 2 slides are that we do indeed find beta 1 to be 0, but it's 0 for both IT and non-IT countries. So if you take this test seriously, it says that, yes, inflation expectations have been anchored, but they have been anchored for both groups of countries. Now, when we restrict our attention to high inflation emerging markets, those in the 20+ inflation range, there we do find some evidence that the adoption of IT leads to better anchoring in those EM countries. So here is the result first for the kind of non-high inflation group, inflation below 20%. And I've highlighted the coefficients that you should be looking at, the ones in red. And as I said, the expectation, the hypothesis is beta 1 equal to 0. Indeed, it is. And you can see that there is no difference between the 2 groups. When you look at high inflation EMs, there you will see, if you look at the last column, that there is, the second and the fourth columns, that there is some evidence that the coefficient is larger in non-IT countries than it is in IT countries. So I'm looking at, for instance, the coefficient that is 0.11, 0.10, which are bigger than the corresponding coefficients for IT. Now, they're not statistically significant, but nevertheless, I think there is some case here that perhaps in very high inflation situations, inflation targeting plays some role on the margin in helping. This is the second sort of group of results that I will present. This is based on early work that was done by Ball and Sheridan. And they suggested that it was regression to the mean rather than IT adoption, which explained the decline in advanced economies that had adopted IT. And the analogy they gave, of course, being Americans or at least non-Indians, they gave the example of baseball. So I've adapted it to a much more interesting and popular sport. So suppose a batsman is going through a bad patch, and the person advising him says, well, you have to keep your eye on the ball every time, all through. You should, even when you're sleeping, your divya drishti should be on the ball. So he takes this advice and he sleeps with the ball next to him. That, by the way, is Ajinkya Rahane, who for some reason was sleeping with, or shared a picture of himself sleeping with the ball next to him. So the batsman does that. Now everybody knows in cricket that you go through ups and downs. There are changes in form that are difficult to explain and probably don't have anything to do with a specific thing that you're doing wrong. So sure enough, the batsman's form recovers. There is regression to the mean. But since he had just been given this advice, he attributes it to the good advice to sleep with the ball next to him. And you will see that from these pictures that this is actually a very convincing story for why we see IT adopters supposedly doing well. What you see is that there is a very strong inverse relationship between the initial inflation rate, which is shown on the x-axis, and the change in inflation over a subsequent period after the adoption, which is shown on the y-axis. And you see, a quite stunning negative correlation with an R-square of almost 1, where the higher the inflation rate initially, the better is the inflation performance subsequently. Namely, if your inflation rate was in the 10-12%, it then falls by 6-7-8%. So this is kind of the regression to the mean story, that if inflation is just going through ups and downs for some reason unrelated to adoption of IT or anything, if countries that are at high inflation rate just kind of sleep with the ball next to them, they adopt IT, then in subsequent years their inflation drops and it can get misattributed to the adoption of IT. So this was for advanced economies. For emerging markets, you still get a very striking relationship, again with an R-square of almost, this time of almost 0.8. And again, the story is higher the inflation rate initially, x-axis, the better is the inflation performance, the drop in inflation subsequently. Now we can actually, instead of just the graph, test this quite formally in an easy way. So this is a difference in difference specification. And on the left-hand side, you look at the change in inflation between the post-targeting period and the pre-targeting period. Now, what, in a sense, the proponents of IT were doing was to take that kind of difference, the left-hand side, and regressing it on an IT dummy. So a 0-1 dummy, 1 for IT adopters and 0 for non-adopters. So they were taking the left-hand side, regressing it on this dummy and finding that A1 was negative, namely inflation adopters were experiencing a decline in inflation post-adoption. And they were using this as evidence that inflation targeting was conferring some benefits. But as the previous charts, I hope, have convinced you, if you control for the previous level of inflation, which is done by adding the variable pi pre, inflation in the pre-targeting period on the right-hand side, then you will see that the benefits of IT drop to insignificance. So namely, including pi pre affects the estimate of A. So here is the evidence for advanced economies as well as for emerging markets. So if you look at the first regression, this shows you for the 23 countries, advanced economies, that for 23 advanced economies, it shows you that the IT dummy is negative. It's not quite significant, but it says that IT adopters had lower inflation by 1 percentage point than non-IT adopters. But look what happens when you include the initial inflation. First of all, the initial inflation, this is the pi pre-variable from the previous slide, has a very strong negative coefficient, almost a coefficient of minus 0.9, almost 1. And look what happens to the coefficient of the inflation dummy. Okay? It drops from the 1 to 0. Okay? Now for EMs, it's an even more dramatic story. For EMs, if you had not controlled for initial inflation, you would have been claiming that EMs enjoyed nearly a 5 percentage point, which is a huge impact, decline because of the adoption of inflation target. But when you include the initial inflation, again, the initial inflation is very strong, coefficient of minus 0.7. And look what it does to the coefficient of the IT dummy. It's still negative, no longer significant, but the estimate has your claim about the benefits of IT would drop from minus 5 percentage points to somewhere under 1, and statistically you would not be able to claim that it is different from 0. So I think this is a very striking demonstration of regression to the mean as an explanation for why IT seems to confer benefits. Now you can do the same thing for growth. Sometimes it's claimed that inflation targeting helps growth outcomes. Not everybody claims that. There are other people like at the International Labor Organization and in other circles, they actually make the claim that IT adoption by making people into what Mervyn King calls inflation nutters actually harms growth. So on growth, there are stories on both sides about what inflation targeting does. But in any case, what you see here is that even in growth, there is strong regression to the mean. So any sort of alleged benefits or costs have to be assessed after you include the initial growth. Okay. You can see that in the R square increases a lot when you control for initial growth. But none of these are really significant, so it's probably not worth claiming too much one way or the other on the basis of these coefficients. And this is the third and the final piece of evidence. Now you might argue that the evidence that I just showed you about regression to the mean that involves kind of a cross-country panel framework, and you might say a lot of detail is being missed. The calculation should really be done on a case-by-case basis, comparing situations in one country more exactly to the other. So that is what we do in this synthetic control method. This is also a difference in difference estimation. This is done country by country. And what we do here is that we think of the country that has adopted inflation as kind of a treatment group or the treatment country. And we try to compare this treatment country to a control. And this control is made up as a weighted average of countries that had inflation outcomes similar to the treatment group prior to the adoption of inflation targeting. So there's an important qualifier that is left out of the third bullet, so please keep that in mind. So the synthetic control is a weighted average of a peer group of countries that had similar inflation outcomes prior to the adoption of inflation targeting. So, as in treatment control, you're all familiar with the idea. You're trying to, match the experiences of the treatment group with the control group prior to some intervention. Here, the intervention is the adoption of inflation target. So let me show you some examples where there is success in the sense that adoption of inflation targeting leads to lower inflation in the treatment relative to the control group. So on the left, you're looking at Mexico, which adopted inflation around 2001. And the solid line is giving you Mexico's inflation before it adopted inflation targeting. The dotted line is the synthetic Mexico that we constructed, countries that look like Mexico and whose experience, when you weight them appropriately, the weights are chosen by the method, by the way, we don't obviously judgmentally just pick it. So the synthetic Mexico is the group of countries whose inflation experience weighted appropriately mirrors that of Mexico. And you can see it, it broadly does before the adoption of inflation targeting. And then after 2001, the vertical line shown in the graph, you look at the inflation experience subsequently. And you can see quite clearly that the solid line, Mexico, is way below the synthetic Mexico. So this is an example of a case where the synthetic control method would say that Mexico benefited in terms of inflation outcomes from its adoption of inflation targeting. Another successful case is Poland. You can see the Poland and the synthetic Poland have virtually identical inflation outcomes prior to Poland's adoption of inflation targeting. So in that sense, the synthetic, the control group and the treatment group are quite well matched prior to the intervention. And then you can see after the intervention, Poland's experience with inflation is clearly better than that of the synthetic cohort. So these are two examples where it worked. There are also examples where the same method tells you that there was no benefit to the country. So here I've shown you United Kingdom, which adopted inflation in the early 1990s. And you can see there's quite a nice match between the UK and the synthetic UK. But you can see that after the adoption of inflation targeting, there was really no difference between the experience of the UK and the experience of its synthetic cohort. Another country that didn't seem to benefit is Israel. It adopted inflation in the late 1990s. And you can see that synthetic Israel had just as much success in lowering inflation as the real Israel. So what I'm going to show you next is, instead of taking you through chart by chart every country, just show you in one bar chart what was the experience across the group of countries that we looked at. So this is now giving you the declines in inflation, or the difference in inflation between the IT adopters and the synthetic control. So if you just look at the second bar from the left, that is Mexico. So I was just showing you the experience of Mexico, and as I said, it's a success. It's a success in the sense that the average inflation in Mexico compared to its synthetic counterpart was 6 percentage points lower. So quite a huge gain. So New Zealand gained, Mexico, Poland. Poland was the other example I was showing you. So that's the third bar from the left. And then I showed you some examples of countries that did not gain so much: United Kingdom and Israel. And what about these bars that are on the right? So these are countries where actually the adoption of inflation targeting was led to, not in a causal sense perhaps, but was associated with worse inflation performance than the synthetic control. Okay. So Indonesia, Ghana had inflation rates worse than their synthetic counterparts. And so if you look across it, as I hope the visually it's telling you, yes, you have some successes from IT using this metric: New Zealand, Mexico, Poland, Colombia. But you also have a lot of countries where it did not work, and a lot of countries where it actually caused some damage by this metric. You can also look at what happened to the growth, comparing the IT adopters with the synthetic controls. Again, visually, you can see that the message is that it's a mixed picture. There are some countries that seem to gain, Ghana gains, Colombia, etc. And there are countries where the growth performance after adopting inflation targeting was worse than the growth performance of the synthetic control, and New Zealand is in that group. So if you remember, New Zealand was one of the countries that had good inflation performance post IT adoption. It also, from this chart, you can see has had worse growth performance post IT adoption. Okay? So you might wonder, what is the overall picture? Is there a case that IT adoption leads to systematically worse growth outcomes, which, as I said, is what folks at the ILO and others have often argued, that a single-minded focus on inflation detracts from growth. There is modest, I would say modest evidence for that view, which is shown here. So here I've shown you the correlation between the bars that you were looking at for the inflation performance and the bars on the previous slide, which were the...
Prakash?
Yeah.
Sorry for intervening.
No,
but
not at all.
Just clarification, the weights
Yeah.
for the SCM are different for the inflation and the growth for the same country?
They can be, yeah. So, it's conceptually, you could think that you want to have the same synthetic control, that once you pick the countries based on the inflation outcome, and then use that same to see what happened to growth, or you can optimize it and just say, I will use somewhat different weights. So in this case, we kept the weights the same, because we are sort of more interested in the inflation performance.
Right.
So we said, matching it, how does it look? Yeah.
Okay.
And I should have said, people should feel free to interrupt. Unfortunately, in this setting, I can't see if people have questions, since I only see myself and my slides.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this chart is showing you the correlation between the two sets of bars that I showed you on the previous slide, and there is some modest evidence, as I said, for what I consider the kind of the ILO view, namely that a country like New Zealand that was able to was able to improve its inflation performance through adoption of IT, saw systematically worse growth performance. So you can see that there is a positive correlation with an R-square of about 0.2. So I would not overplay this evidence, but I think it's nevertheless interesting and perhaps an avenue to dig in further to see what impact IT adoption has on growth. And here we're talking about long-run growth. It can also have, as people see, mistakes, policy mistakes can lead to short-term growth errors as well. So let me conclude with the lessons from what I have shown you today on today's paper and some implications. So what I hope to have shown you is that inflation moderation of the last 2 decades has happened almost everywhere. Those were the initial pictures I showed you. I've suggested that there are 2 broad classes of explanations: improved monetary management, and particularly the spread of inflation targeting. And the second is the structural factors. The evidence that I've shown you from this paper, I hope, has convinced you that formal adoption of IT is neither necessary nor sufficient for improved inflation or growth outcomes. Now, you might say, well, you've made too much of a distinction of IT versus non-IT. It could be that all central banks are basically doing some form of IT, whether they formally adopt it or not. So it could be that central bank performance has just improved across the board. Now, the evidence I've shown you does not rule out that case. So, you could still make that argument. But if you make that argument, and our question to the central banking and institutions like the IMF would be, why then place such an emphasis on the formal adoption of IT? Why are you encouraging countries to say formally that they are IT targeters if what is going on is some other form of improved monetary management? Why make it such a article of faith that you have to adopt IT and then good things will follow? Okay. And more broadly, the implication of this whole project that Surjit, Karan, and I are working on is that if you follow the science, we think that the claims about the benefits of IT adoption should be established rather than we feel as they are now asserted by the central banking community. And all the evidence that I've showed you, I think, makes the case that IT might be a placebo, not a vaccine. And it could be worse than a placebo because there can be costs to the adoption of IT. Placebo is, not supposed to help you or hurt you. It's supposed to leave you without any problems. But it could be worse if there are some costs to the adoption of IT. On the other hand, the other part of our work is that while trying to get people to take the claims of improved monetary management with a much more skeptical eye, we are also in parallel trying to show you that structural or non-monetary factors can explain the decline in inflation and therefore deserve serious consideration. So before I conclude, let me just give you a quick glimpse of these points that come from our other papers. One thing, as I said, is that IT could be worse than a placebo if it leads to policy mistakes. And there is some reason to worry about this because there have been many famous instances where kind of a single-minded focus on inflation leads to rate hikes at inappropriate moments. So Surjit's book talks about Greenspan's February 1995 rate hike, which turned out to be not his greatest call. The ECB, quite famously, hiked rates in July 2008, just as the global financial crisis was getting underway and picking up steam. They were worried about the impact of oil prices on inflation and hiked rates. They did it again in 2011 when the euro crisis was so, and Nouriel Roubini called it the biggest mistake ever. Sweden's central bank raised rates in 2010 when their unemployment was still at 9%, which led to a famous dissent by Lars Svensson. And in our previous paper, and in Surjit's other work, he has talked about how India's policy interest rates over this 2016 to 2019 period were higher always than the RBI's neutral real policy rate, which is shown in the chart on the right. So the orange line is the neutral policy interest rate, real policy interest rate, and the blue line is almost always above it. So there can be, and Surjit has argued that this had an impact on growth over that period. And here is just a glimpse on why we should take structural views seriously. In his book, New Wealth of Nations, Surjit has shown quite convincingly that there has been a steady expansion of college-educated workers in the developing world, and that they have displaced workers in the West, initially displacing those with less than a college education, but increasingly as workers in the West or the global South get more and more skilled themselves, they are starting to offer competition even to people in the West with higher skills. And the consequence is low wage growth in advanced economies and low inflation. And in his book, Surjit has this very nice chart, which is shown on the right, which shows how you can actually quite accurately track the median inflation rate in advanced economies on the basis of this, what he calls unlimited supply, the expansion of the supply of skilled labor. And one very interesting piece of evidence that he presented in the IEO webinar recently was to see what has been happening to college premiums in the West, here represented by the US. And what you can see if you focus on the picture to the right, the premium for men, you can see it's been declining quite steadily over the decades. So the first bar is for 1980 to 1989. The last one is the most recent for 2010 to 2019. And you can see a quite sharp and steady decline in the college premiums in the US. Okay, so let me end on this note. Again, thanking EGROW for the opportunity to debut our new work on whether inflation targeting is vaccine or placebo. Thank you.
Thank you, authors. Before, I think what I will do is, instead of making, generally I make comments at this point, but I'm going to first invite Professor Dr. Ashima Goyal, professor at IGDR and member of the RBI MPC, to give her observations, and then I'll make some. Go ahead, Ashima. Can't hear you.
You can't hear? Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Yeah, nice paper, well presented. So I think that what I would say about inflation targeting is that, and I think your work largely supports it, that it's not a panacea, it's not a placebo. I mean, it's worse than a placebo, maybe, I agree. But it depends on how it is done, right? Because you found that there are some countries and periods or synthetic view, etc., that it worked. Because the point is to understand central bank practice. This big difference from, say, the Greenspan era to the Bernanke era. That's a multiple equilibria view. That the markets can go wrong. That it's not about perfect markets and a full employment equilibrium. And that central banks have to guide them in some way, right? And now, if you are going to guide them, then the economy and what central banks say is notoriously very, very complex. So one of the things inflation targeting has done is really to force you to focus on inflation. The underlying that is growth, financial stability, exchange rate, all sorts of variables. So it's how all those variables enter and affect inflation. So it helps you to focus and communicate to markets. So in that way, I think, and now we have artificial intelligence and so many people who work on central bank statements and how many words and what those words mean, etc. So, it's a way to put order on what you say, to communicate. But still, and then for emerging markets, I think you found that the volatility fell, right? On one of your results. I don't know, I haven't seen just what I sort of recollect from the presentation. So, and the big problem in emerging markets, the current juncture, for example, when you're expecting large outflows as the US Fed raises rates, is this sort of the risk premium shoots up. If you're dependent on foreign capital, you have some like we made that mistake in 2013 and in 2018. We raised rates in response. So, if to the extent inflation is more stable as it is currently, which is largely because in India, because of very good fiscal monetary coordination and fiscal action that reduces supply side inflation, then the possibility of this risk premium rising, etc., reduces. So, but again, about communication and for emerging markets, and I don't know if you take care of this in your estimation, because we find that the US, what is happening to US inflation has a huge impact on us and market expectations of central bank rates rising, etc. Just because the US is going to tighten. I mean, I was surprised Obstfeld was here and he was saying that EMs will lose credibility if they don't tighten. I said, why is that if your cycle is very different? But our markets, in the current monetary policy, we're seeing markets are pricing in a much steeper rate rise than the RBI wants to do. That's one reason we held and sort of, trying to communicate that we have been tightening or rebalancing. RBI has been rebalancing liquidity since last year. Normalization started much earlier than the Fed, right? So you don't need to have very large steps. But it's really funny because analysts would say earlier when the US was saying inflation is temporary, and India said that Indian inflation is different. We have a long history of inflation, so we can't say it's temporary like the US. Now, when the US is saying it's not, it's permanent. I mean, it's not temporary. It's likely to persist. Then, we say our inflation is different. They say, which is their argument. They won't agree. They say no. US is rise. So in India, inflation is very much in the target band, and it's expected in the end of this fiscal year to go down towards 4. And we have capital account, sort of limitation on interest-free inflows, which are only 2% of market turnover, very strong reserves. So that gives so the idea is that communication is a difficult thing, and perhaps inflation targeting helps with it. So I've also done some estimations with controls, and you have used a lot of those and so on. And we find that there's another thing I want to flag. 2 things we found. One, that in the IT period, expectations converge faster. And second is what I call the thin market effect. That what central bank says when you compare with advanced economies has much more effect. The convergence is faster. Central bank communication works more. Projected because inflation is thin. Like we have a lot of media, but there's so much focus on the RBI statements because there's less, there's more attention paid to what government bodies and organizations are saying. So that is one way in which perhaps this communication, projected inflation part, and so on. So finally, I would Surjit, have you long been saying structural causes of inflation, low wages or low wage growth because of competition from emerging markets maybe? And now we are seeing high wage growth, high inflation. Do you see this as temporary or something that's likely to persist? So finally, I agree that inflation targeting can work. It gives you powerful tools, additional communication tools to use when you recognize multiple equilibria. And modern markets are so dependent on what is going to happen to interest rates. So guiding them and preventing volatility is very important. But it depends on how it is done, because I agree that the initial phases of inflation targeting in India was too strict, was not flexibly used, was not proper, and it created adversity.
Thanks very much. Would you like me to respond, Arvind, or should we collect some questions?
Let me come in now because we had requested her to speak. Yeah. So actually, I was also on that informal advisory committee of the RBI from 2013, I think, roughly to 2016, before the MPC was formed. Really, I think, and one saw that consistent and persistent overestimation of inflation and therefore over-tightening, which continued after the MPC was formed. And the analysis which I did, I don't know whether you've seen the paper, the J-curve of institutional change, which is a EGROW paper. Perhaps Karan can send you copy. But the point in a way there was, which actually is consistent with some of your results on emerging markets, is that really there's a learning period and you may actually do worse. So in some sense, that J curve of institutional change provides a framework for some of your results on the negative effects of inflation targeting. So you might want to just look at it. In fact,
Okay.
I guess, yeah. So in fact, I was talking to Karan a couple of days ago that maybe we can apply this. He suggested the synthetic control method to test the analysis was basically general about institutional change. There's no formal econometrics there, but I would suspect that probably an SCM, if I apply it to that, perhaps Karan, when he's free, will do that to see what actually comes out. Because there was not just the MPC framework, there were a couple of other major institutional changes actually. I think if I've understood, Ashima, of course you can answer, but two things which would interest me also, and one of course is the so-called thin market effect. I mean, I have repeatedly said from all my 30 years of giving advice on macro that imperfect and incomplete markets make all these things different in India, emerging markets, whatever you want to call it, from what happens in the developed countries. So I think a little more attention to that differential between the developed countries, etc. would, I mean, all the things I've said in the past 20 years don't come to my mind right now, but maybe at some point when I think of them, I'll point them out. And of course, the other point about volatility, which is more difficult actually. I don't know. I think that's the point perhaps you'll be addressing. So go ahead. Why don't you answer a question and then I'll call on some of the others who raise their hands.
Okay. Thanks. I'll start, but then Surjit and Karan should also jump in since they are more familiar with the India-specific experience than I am. But broadly, Ashima, of course, that is, I mean, the way you started is our point, which is that, IT adoption, in our view at least, has often been sold as a panacea that, you adopt it and things will start to go well. And what our evidence shows is that sometimes it has worked and sometimes it hasn't, and doesn't seem to be any kind of systematic explanation for why it works and why it doesn't. So, I mean, our results are not inconsistent with saying this is a fairly random, difficult to pin down effect. But I agree with you that we need to understand why sometimes things are successes and why they are not. So, I mean, my preference would be to just look at successful inflation experiences in terms of countries that have been able to reduce inflation, regardless of whether or not they adopted IT. Go at it from that angle and exactly come to the point that you said, which is, let's try to understand what are the inflation successes, and if we can see if there were elements in common across those experiences, because that's what we want to understand, not whether they formally adopted IT or not, which at least to me, it doesn't seem that the evidence strongly supports that it's a common element in inflation successes. In fact, quite opposite. I mean, sometimes quite the opposite. So I think in terms of the broad message, I completely agree that we want to sell the message that it's not a panacea. And then your second sort of big comment, which I think we have not addressed yet, but we could, is whether IT confers other benefits in terms of communication to markets, as you were saying, or is it more effective in dealing with thin market effects? So I think that, to my recollection, we have not looked at, but this project has gone on for 1 year or more, and Karan may have run many other tests that are sitting on the chopping floor somewhere. So yeah, I think that's something we can look at is, does it confer benefits in terms of, lower real interest rates? Does it bring down risk premiums, etc.? And I think that would be quite interesting. I mean, if it turns out that these other benefits in terms of inflation and growth are not systematic, but every IT adopter is able to bring down real interest rates, bring down the real risk premium component of it, I think that would be quite an interesting finding. And you're right, we should be thinking of that and adding that to our results. And also, Arvind, both your points are well taken. I think there could be indeed a learning period where you go through policy mistakes and therefore do worse post adoption, but then you get better. But I think there's equally a case that you start out by being a bit too dogmatic, and that is the source of mistakes, and then you kind of become more flexible, which again, I'm not an expert on India, but that is my reading of what could have happened in India, is that initially during the credibility period, you have to basically build up your credibility. You have to be a bit of an inflation nutter in the early phases, and then that leads to bad outcomes, and then you kind of have to be more flexible. And
that's exactly what happened. They were nutters and refused to listen. But maybe Surjit wants to.
Okay, yeah, Surjit, maybe it's a good time to bring you in.
I think they were exactly that. They were nutters, but I couldn't in my paper call them that. But Surjit, I'm sure, has done it many times.
It would be good to test
if thanks.
with flexible inflation targeting involved.
Yeah, they probably went from being nutters to being more flexible. That's absolutely very good hypothesis, which fits. Anyway, Surjit, sorry.
Yeah. I think Ashima raised some very good points, and our approach in this, and Prakash mentioned this, been going on for a year plus and still counting, was to take every possible explanation and examine it to see if there are any effects. I think that's the approach. Now, you mentioned about communication to markets, etc. Well, it should show up in some of the other stuff. If they are communicating, it should show up either in growth, it should show up in inflation, it should show up somewhere. So I think we are, as a profession, very quick to take quote unquote established wisdom, which may have not been established at that point in time. And New Zealand is a classic case. I remember very much when the New Zealand thing happened, the inflation targeting in mid-80s, and it was the rage all over as to how profoundly they had done and changed the course of history, literally, of growth and inflation, and turned it from an emerging markets to a developed country markets and foreign exchange, etc. So I want to, we are very willing and have been, and that's why one test after another, dream up. So I would say dream up a test is a challenge to all of you and to ourselves to show that inflation targeting works. And it turns out it hasn't. That's the unfortunate reality. So I would only say that while the explanation that communication to markets, bond markets, capital account convertibility, this, that, whatever you throw in, it doesn't work. So it is, I think that's why we are now working on the structural side. Something else is happening. It's not policy. And I would just end on two notes. One, let's recall how money supply was considered to be a big factor on inflation. and the Fed stopped publishing money supply figures. And I would say this is worth a test for ourselves and for you. I think it was in 1986, or may have been a bit, yeah. They stopped 84 rather, stopped publishing money supply figures. And soon, money supply did not affect the markets. Otherwise, every week at 4:15 p.m., there would be, all of us would be all around the bond market as to what would happen and what would happen to stock markets, what would happen to growth, what would happen to everything on weekly money supply figures. So that's how the established wisdom was. And, then I think within a month, and it's worth a test actually, when did it start? Within a month, there was no discussion of money supply numbers in the bond market, in communication, in markets elsewhere, etc. So I think, we have to be, as policy advisors, and all of us have been in that role at one time or another, a bit more humble. There are global forces, and that's why I subscribe pretty much to the globalization, whether it's inflation or any other issue. These are forces much beyond our control, and they dominate, much beyond the control of any specific individual, country, or policymaker. I'll end there, but it's been a challenge. We want to find some effect. We haven't, but willing to test anything you guys come up with.
Okay, Karan, do you want to say? I see you're raising your hand. You want to respond?
Yeah,
I think
Ashima does too. So
Yeah, I think,
Ashima and then Karan, maybe. Okay, Ashima.
Just that communication would affect volatility, no? So that's one way to.
No,
Yeah.
ma'am. So I wanted to respond to just that. We did classify as inflation targeters and non-targeters and looked at volatility of both inflation and inflation expectations, and the differences are not that stark, which was particularly surprising because one would expect that after inflation targeting you get a significant drop in volatility of inflation expectations for the inflation targeting countries in particular. So that was a very surprising result even for us, that at the aggregate level, when you just take the average, you don't see any significant result. And I think a lot of it has to do with, again, what you mentioned, that how it is implemented across countries is of course different, which is the point that we are making, that this is not a one size fit all policy that you can implement and it will work everywhere in every country across the world. And the point on the institutional change, sir, we did it. Of course, we have a lot of results, and some of them are in the paper, and some of them are just robustness checks. So when we were doing synthetic control, we started looking at 3 different horizons of the post-inflation targeting period. For, of course, late inflation targeters such as India, we didn't have that much time because it was implemented in 2016. But for most countries, we had like 3, 5, and 10 years. So what we did was that we took the average difference between the actual and the synthetic control, variable for both inflation and growth, and we just did a simple t-test on it, and there again, we don't find much difference in the results per se. So it could indeed be that for at the margin, some countries might have learned and become better at IT, but overall we don't see a significant change in the adoption of IT at the aggregate level. But it's of course something that's worth looking into detail to see whether there is some change for some of the countries, and if across periods the good performing countries change. So for instance, we have some countries that did worse 3 years after, but they did much better relatively in the post 5-year phase. So I just wanted to add
so frankly, I really having kind of I really don't see the contradiction actually. Inflation targeting was supposed to be a very formal thing, but there's 2 issues. You assumed that inflation targeting would give you more credibility, but a central bank can have credibility by itself. So the issue is not inflation targeting, but credibility. And similarly, if you are saying communication, I mean, before inflation targeting, there was my good friend Venu Reddy, who has a lot of credibility. Okay. And he did the communication. You don't need to tie it in with the inflation targeting, you know. So credibility is an issue by itself, and so is the communication. So I don't see how proving or disproving one can prove or disprove the other, which is exactly what I guess I interpret Prakash to say, right? So
Yeah, I think
I think it's a different issue. Not that it's not relevant. Obviously, it's relevant, in practice. But I would say that exactly that inflation targeting was oversold. I think the results now prove it. And it really became an ideological issue, you know. What you are trying to do is move away from the ideology, and I know you, we were there for 3 years together, is to say, okay, you have to manage, you have to, when the inflation flares up, there's a lot of excitement around and you have to figure out what to do. Yeah. And maybe, in the old days, it would have been handled pragmatically. I mean, as I said, I knew Venu for a long time and it was handled. I just don't, the evidence now really supports that this was a big ideological crusade, which actually did a lot of harm for 6 years. I am not convinced at all now, particularly with the evidence which you have produced, that actually this was at all necessary. You could say that if you appoint central bank governors who are not credible, you put some fellow there who has no reputation or anything, then maybe you need inflation targeting. But I don't, again, it's an issue of credibility. Anyway, Surjit, you want to we have to move on to some other questions. So if you will be just quick, please.
Yeah, very briefly, and this is particularly appropriate for an Indian audience. Forever, Indian monetary policy makers have felt there was an inflation due to a supply shock and food inflation in particular, and the monetary policies authorities reacted by saying, okay, we can tackle oil price shocks, we can tackle food price shocks by raising interest rates. And I'm afraid the same identical arguments are being made in the US today, less in the advanced countries, but prominently in the US. And I think this is something to keep in the back of the mind. Some things never change. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I have enough experience of actually watching policy being made that there's a difference. We always used to say supply versus demand shocks and all, but an ideologue doesn't seem to get that. And I've seen it up close. I mean, you can watch the ideologues. They just, to them, these are just words. They don't operate on that principle. Anyway, I think Charan and Vishen Das, quick questions. Charan, you want to say something?
Let Vishen Das go first.
Quick one, Dr. Vishen Das. Because we are running out of time. I also will have to go in 15 minutes. Dr. Vishen Das, you wanted to say something? Where are you?
Sir, yeah, thank you very much. And I congratulate Prakash for giving a very wonderful and masterful exposition. My question is, you have analyzed those who have done the IT, the country from 89 onward, New Zealand and so on, so forth. But I would be interesting to know, when you control the inflation, at what cost? Now, let me give an example. Unless you trace that success or failure of those targeting the inflation, at what cost the government is paying. For example, just give a specific example. In India, suppose onion prices rise, that shows in the food price inflation, and the first reaction of the government is to stop outright export of onion. Now the farmer suffers huge losses. Now this also shows government has a policy bias in favor of consumer in relation to the interest of the producer. And so this is an example. Obviously,
Okay. Thank you, Professor. We really running out. So I noted your question. Charan, you want to
I was
give
very
questions?
impressed. I was very impressed with the results, to be very honest with you. Ball and Sheridan had come out with similar conclusions, and I was waiting to listen from all of you. And you have basically reiterated, and in a far more rigorous and robust manner, that it doesn't really matter. So I must thank you for that. I'm totally in sync with the chairman when he says the costs have to be measured. My only point was in your exercise, have you ever, and I've been talking about this for some time now, have you seen for the demographic effects which might be influencing inflation? So if you have done the two countries, ITs and non-ITs, and was there any factor which one could isolate and say, and to my mind, one factor could have been a demographic. If it is a younger demographic in the country, maybe the behavior would be different from the one which is a normal trend. So this is just one thought. My own feeling is that demographics makes a dent. There was one paper I have seen so far by one person in Japan. The deputy governor spoke about it, and I don't think much research has been done after that. Another paper I saw was at the IMF. Just want to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Prakash, you want to just respond to both those questions, whatever you want to say? Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah, so thanks, Professor Vishandas. I think that was one of the points that we were trying to make, is that IT adoption is not just a placebo. It can come with costs. It can come because I think actually, as Arvind was just saying, I mean, if it leads you to reflect not so much on it leads you to kind of not focus on what is needed, which is the demand versus supply drivers of inflation, but just say, inflation bad, I must bring it down, because that is what IT sometimes when it's implemented badly forces you to do, and particularly in the early stages when you're building credibility. If there is a supply side shock to inflation from onion prices or whatever, you're sort of in a box where to build the credibility, even though you know that the inflation may be a supply-driven phenomenon, you nevertheless have to, in a sense, pretend that it's a demand-driven thing, and you have to try to build it down. That, I think Arvind was making that point, that once you place yourself in that box as I'm Mr. Inflation Fighter, then it takes away your freedom to say this is a supply-driven shock which I'm going to ride out. You have to, in a sense, misidentified it as a demand shock. So I think that's very much one of the points we want to make. And to Charan, I think I'm very happy to hear that you like the Ball and Sheridan results, because what we have done is in a sense quite a significant extension, in the sense this is 20 more years of data, and this is 80 more countries. The whole EM experience was not analyzed in Ball and Sheridan because there were not that many EM adopters. But so in some sense it's an extension, but the amount of new information that is going into that same framework is enormous. And as you said, the results hold up extremely strongly, and it's quite striking. On the demographics, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
somebody.
please. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just finishing up on the demographic effects. Maybe I will let Surjit say something on that. I think that as he said, he and I have emphasized the globalization explanation for the decline in inflation. But I think as we read more, we are quite convinced that demographics also plays quite an important role in driving that. And I remember, actually with Larry Ball sitting with one of the former governors of the Bank of Japan, who basically said, you guys, meaning the IMF and the academic community, are completely wrong about the forces of inflation, and assigning a very big role to demographics. But I think Surjit has both been reading some more, and actually we have our own work, I think, also suggesting a strong role for demographics. Surjit, you want to say something on that?
Very quickly, this demographics, capital, mobility, and unlimited supplies of skilled labor, all three, and this is for all econometricians and any advice, all three have strong time trends. And it is very difficult to separate out the effects. I had tried to do that in my book with demographics and both of them together. One way to think about it is to put demographics in the same equation as the unlimited supplies of skilled labor. And the demographics variable is rendered completely insignificant. Whereas, and these are results all presented then in 2017, I'll run it again. And we are working on this actually. But, so it's a very interesting econometric issue when you have such a strong time trend. So co-integration doesn't solve it. So the only way so far we have done is to test everything together, dump everything in. But I think it's a very, we're going to do that as per your suggestion. Actually, it's a very good one, that look at the IT, put IT in there, and
Right.
then have demographics, and then have unlimited supply, to try and unravel the separate effects, which are near impossible to do because they're time trends. But one time trend, if you put both of them together, demographics doesn't work. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So actually, the issue, you said supply. Actually, now I just remembered the excuse which was always given, that even though it may be a supply shock, it will affect expectations and then lead to higher inflation.
Right.
So I noticed that in your talk, at least, you've not really brought in the expectation story, which I often hear from others. So if you just want to say a little bit on that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's also perhaps what Surjit was alluding to at the end about the implications for the current conjuncture. So even now, we know that the current upsurge in inflation is possibly a supply story, or at least quite substantially influenced by supply constraints or supply shortages.
Right.
But nevertheless, if you have the view that inflation expectations have to be managed, and that's the channel of transmission to higher inflation, then you're indeed put in this box of, as the Fed is, of having to react to this. So I mean, obviously there's both demand and supply going on at this point. I don't want to just claim that it's completely a global supply chain story, but nevertheless, you probably have to underweight the supply story in your mind if you really think that you have to manage expectations. So I think that is a real and present danger at the current conjuncture. I think that's perhaps.
No, I agree. So I'll come to Surjit in a second. I agree with you. I think this is where the ideology comes in, because that judgment is very biased by ideology. Because if you just are a true believer in this targeting business, you just, which you also kind of agreed earlier. Yeah. So Surjit.
Yeah.
The very important point on this expectations, and one, we obviously try and test for it, and doesn't have much effect. Second, in the present context, there was an article just 2 or 3 days ago where the markets rallied because, apart from being affected by Ukraine or by Russia, that inflation expectations in the US medium term hadn't really gone up, corresponding to the big upsurge in inflation. But it is the correct, I think, avenue to look at, and we've tested for it one way, but I think that's an important policy question, and let's see what happens.
So in a way, I don't know, as you said, you're kind of fed up after a year of research, but maybe some way to differentiate between supply shocks and demand shocks, especially in emerging market economies, may give something. So just as a suggestion. Okay, let's see. I have about 4 minutes. Charan, do you see any question on your chat box? We could take one. No? You're muted.
Sorry, I was seeing that Pulapre is here, and I thought he wanted to ask a question.
Okay, Professor, is he there? I don't see. Yeah. Huh? Who is there?
No, there he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Professor, yes, Balakrishnan.
Thank you,
Go
Dr.
ahead.
Loungani. Thank you. I'll be very brief. I was very struck by the clarity of the presentation, Dr. Loungani. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm also struck about the amount of work that has gone in. And I also have broad sympathy with this framework which looks at monetary management versus structural factors. My only question is, perhaps you're going to go to do that. Why don't you do a tiny bit more economic modeling? Can it not? Is it really very difficult to pit the kind of model that underlies inflation targeting with a structural model or model which has structural factors? Ultimately, you need to do that, it seems to me, because however strong your result on the regression to mean is, to my mind, I may not have understood you very well, it's slightly empiricist. I can't figure out the economics of it sufficiently. Maybe I'm missing something. And I just want to conclude by expressing one tiny disappointment in your comparison of IT versus the synthetic cohort. India is explicitly missing. I would have been hugely interested in seeing India. That's so easily done. And that's kind of obvious oversight or exclusion. And I'm a little disappointed. But I have views on it, and I'll complete with that. I and a co-author of mine, by name M. Parameshwaran of the Center for Development Studies, have tested the New Keynes and Phillips curve with a structuralist explanation of inflation in India. And we can explain fully econometrically the decline in inflation after 2016 by a structuralist model without reference to expectations. And I want to say, in fact, it's very difficult to find a statistically significant New Keynes and Phillips curve for India. And it's just not us. It's almost everybody who's tested this before us. And I just want to conclude by saying that actually the inflation rate was well within the targeted band even before 2016 and has been in the past. So unlike in the West, for India, it's not as if inflation targeting adopted in 2016 was delivering something terribly new. We have had this in the past also. In fact, inflation rate has been declining for at least 5 years, maybe more, before 2016. So I just want to finish with that and say I enjoyed your paper, and await some more, if you wish, structural economic modeling, monetary management versus structural factors. If you can do it for the world, for 100 countries, that would be, and get very clear results. I mean, that would be really something. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for reminding. I remember your talk now. I had just slipped my mind.
Thank you, Arvind. Thank you so much indeed.
So he had some expectations in the equation. You might want to look at his paper and see. So I would commend you because that's what I found. It was your paper. That's why I found that specific thing was missing. So maybe you can just take a look at his paper, what he means.
It's an Ashoka University discussion paper at the moment. It's not a publication. Find it on the Ashoka website quite easily. And let me just say that we model expectations as rational expectations, i.e. plugging in the actual rate for the next year in the New Keynes and Phillips curve, and also use RBI survey-based expectations. Neither is significant in an explanation of inflation in India. It's kind of interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're running out of time. Sorry, Professor.
I just want to say that I have,
please.
The RBI expectations, I have looked at your paper and it was quite, but I would not use the RBI expectations measure as evidence of anything, but that's
anyway. Because anyway, yours is cross-country, so you have to take some standard. That's fine, right. Prakash and Karan, do you want to make any concluding remarks? Because I also have to go, sorry, but anything
No, I
you
think
want to add?
I took notes of what Professor Balakrishnan said, and I will follow up. I don't think we are in disagreement on those
Yeah.
points. Just quickly on why we did not do the synthetic control for India. It's just that India is a very late adopter, as Karan was saying. So you need sufficient time to elapse after the intervention to really have a successful, to have a really convincing case that the treatment differs from the control. But so I think it's more convincing for the early adopters, New Zealand, Mexico, and so on. For India, you could present the results, but the error bounds are probably going to be huge.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Anybody? Karan, you want to add something? Surjit? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. That was enjoyable, and we had a very good discussion. Very happy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and let me hand it over to Charan to conclude.
Quickly, I want to check. Professor Polapre Balakrishnan is the one on 19th March 2021 that you presented at EGROW. Is it the same paper? You're mute. You're mute.
You're right. You're right. Except since then, we've actually used the RBI's expectations, which Dr. Bhalla doesn't think much of. But if the RBI is actually basing its policy on expectations, which researchers don't think is very good, it's really, it's really something to worry about. But anyway, in the paper that we presented, we just have a rational expectations modeling strategy. But subsequently, we use the RBI's actual household expectations data, and the result is unchanged. Thank you.
So I would just like to mention the paper that Professor Balakrishnan was mentioning was delivered at the EGROW Foundation on March 19, 2021. I can send you the recording. By the way, it's available on our website. If I have the permission of the chairman and the three authors, can we call it the impatient targeting? It wasn't worth it. And the whole world was pushed into it. The scientists wanted to show they are active and they can also deliver. So why not call it impatient targeting?
There's an extra problem. If you have a 2-year or 3-year term, you want to get it all done within the 3 years.
Okay. So
the impatient
like
targeting that killed the patient.
Yes, exactly. So I'm on the tweet.
Impatient implies that after patient amount of time, it will work. Better version is junk targeting.
Well, yeah, no. Okay, anyway, let's not. Yeah.
On the tweet,
Charan,
on
go
the
ahead.
tweet, on the tweet, I'm going to mention the inpatient targeting. Work. Okay. Now I have to make an announcement by tomorrow noon. Today's presentation will be available on our website. I'm sure many of us are going to listen to it again, and many of us are going to use it differently. So you're most welcome to do it. Next week, same time, we have Professor Lakshmi Narayanan from London Business School delivering a talk. I'll share with you the exact topic and the title, but next Friday, same time, Lakshmi Narayanan from London Business School. I would like to welcome all of you for that presentation too. With that, I want to thank our chairman. I want to thank the three panelists and our guests to spend time with us today and make this discussion so lively, especially Professor Ashima Goel, whom we requested to be sort of a semi-discussant for this paper, and others who asked questions and made the discussion so rich. So thank you all, and thanks very much, and see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Arvind. Thanks, Ashima. Thanks, Charan.